Welcome, everyone. I'm Deb Mathias, Director of the QRIS National Learning Network with the BUILD Initiative. We'd like to welcome everyone today to the Let's Talk session, Understanding, Applying, and Doing Research in QRIS Systems Building. This series is made possible through the support of the Alliance for Early Success, along with other generous supporters. We began this series for state quality administrators to support their important work within states around systems building. Quality administrators are welcome to invite other participants as related to the specific topic of the call, and we know a number of you invited your research partners to join us today. We hope these calls enable us to share challenges, innovation, and promising practices between us. PowerPoints and resources will be posted on the QRIS National Learning Network website under the webinar sessions as related to this session, and direct presentation audio will be posted, but the audio discussion, although taped, won't be posted. After the session, a survey will pop up asking for your suggestions, resources that we could post along with the webinar, or questions you'd like to tackle, and we would appreciate your input. If you're working on a promising practice in your state, volunteer to present it and engage with colleagues around the topic. A few thoughts as we begin our discussion today. As we're all moving deeper into the QRIS work within states, there's been a great deal of conversation and discussion about the emerging research related to QRIS and the component areas of QRIS. Like example would be the effectiveness of technical assistance or other smaller types of research studies. This information will begin to come out more and more our bi-monthly e-news hopefully will be a conduit where we'll be sharing the latest and what states are coming up with. But we're all working together to understand the research limitations, discuss implications of the research for implementation, and glean promising practices. We brought together this expert team to present ideas and give us an opportunity to ask questions and think together about these issues. We want to make this as interactive as possible, and we need your help. Please share any questions or comments you have throughout the session. We'll have selected breaks in the presentations to hear about the work in your state or your questions or your ideas about the content of what a presenter has put out there for us to think about. We've given you some questions up front to think about, and we have questions and ideas that participants sent with their registration, and we'll intersperse those ideas throughout the session. If you have an experience in your state that's relevant to the discussion, please speak up and share. We encourage you to be full participants in the session through your comments, questions, and shared experiences. So you can use two different features. One is raise your hand and let us know that you want to interject a comment or question. We'll recognize you and invite you to unmute your phone and jump right in. And please make sure to identify your state. Or if you prefer, you can type your question or comment into the chat box feature and send it directly to the speaker, or you can share it with the whole group. If we don't have time to work with all of the questions throughout the session, we'll complete a Q&A document and post it on the landing pad after the session. And again, as you see in the chat box, to mute your phone, *6, to unmute, press *7. Let's talk for a moment about what we're hoping to get through today. Okay, today we'll be looking at the tips for reviewing research, things to think about when you're applying research to your own QRIS work, and some advice about conducting research, evaluation, and validation in your own state. Of course, Race to the Top drew many of us into the research sector as a validation project was required with that grant. And that's another reason that we're going to be seeing more and more coming out from the Race to the Top states around this. Well, without further ado, I'd like to hand off the presentation to Catherine Tout. She's a senior research scientist and co-director of the Early Childhood Research at Child Trends. She directs projects from Child Trends Minneapolis office. Catherine's research focuses on quality rating and improvement systems, professional development for the early childhood workforce, and children's school readiness. She's the principal investigator on evaluations of QRIS in Minnesota and New Mexico. And on behalf of OPRE and the Administration for Children and Families, Catherine also directs Inquire. And we're going to ask her to start off talking to us a little bit about the Inquire group. Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about Inquire?
Yes, of course. Hi, Deb. Thank you. And just checking, can you hear me? Debbie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Too many webinars where I've talked and people haven't been able to hear me, so I always want to check. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to take a very quick moment here at the beginning to just briefly mention Inquire, which is the Quality Initiatives Research and Evaluation Consortium. Inquire is a group that's funded through the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, OPRE, in the Administration for Children and Families, and it's managed through a contract that Child Trends, my organization, and Kelly's organization, who you'll hear from in a minute, we have a contract with OPRE to bring together a group primarily of researchers who are interested in work on quality rating and improvement systems and quality improvement initiatives in general. We try to serve as a learning community for researchers so that we can share our strategies, share experiences of the work we've been doing in different states, and share the findings that we are learning in our studies in different states. But we also try to come together and decide on new products that might be useful to the field. And in some cases, in all cases, the products that we've put together for Inquire have been at the request or decided upon in collaboration with our state partners who say it would be really great if we could have a product on such and such topic. And so, and examples of topics that we've addressed through our Inquire work, we've done briefs on evaluation, on validation, on observational measures, and there will be more to come. But I wanted to just start off by saying at the beginning of this webinar, if there are topics that you have had in mind that you think would just be great or you'd love to learn more about, please feel free to send me an email, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about the types of resources that will be useful to you, because we are always looking for new ideas and new ways to help think about this translation of research to practice, but we also know how much we learn from practice about what we need to research. So we love that collaboration. And I guess with that, I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Kelly Maxwell, who's going to kick off the content part of the discussion. I'm so pleased to say that Kelly Maxwell is co-directs the early childhood development area at Child Trends with me and with Tamara Halley. We're so pleased she's joined us. She has over 15 years of experience in early childhood research, policy, and evaluation, and she's known for her work in QRIS, school readiness assessments, and evaluations of other early childhood initiatives. She's worked on several research and evaluation projects in North Carolina, and she's currently providing support for North Carolina's Early Learning Challenge Grant. She's also conducted various evaluation studies for Georgia Department of Early Care and Learning, and she's consulted with multiple states about QRIS. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kelly Maxwell.
Thank you, Catherine. Now I'll do the sound check. Can people hear me okay?
I
Deb,
can hear you
me?
just fine, Kelly.
Okay, thanks. I'm going, there, I'll advance this slide. I'm going to talk about tips in interpreting research, and I thought I would start with some myths. Some of my favorite myths are, numbers don't lie, the numbers say it all, and if the report looks good, the data must be good. I think now that we've all learned how to use color and drop in pictures, I think sometimes people think, well, if the report looks slick, this study must be a really strong study with good findings. And I think you have to realize that bad data can also come in pretty packages. and that it's everyone's job to really question everything when you're reading a research report. Use your own knowledge to interpret the data, particularly if it's data that were collected in your state, so that you really have a good knowledge of the context, and to expect that there will be caveats. There's always limitations to studies. I thought I would start by showing you a graph, a picture, that I think, wow, at first glance you might think that this is great. Looks like an intervention has really had a big effect in improving quality as measured by the ECRS-R compared to a comparison group who didn't get that intervention. Then I'll show another picture where it really looks like, wow, the intervention didn't have much of an effect compared to the comparison in terms of making changes in quality as measured by the ECRS-R. So since it's Halloween, I will say that there was a little trick. Does anybody know what that trick was?
They're the same. It's the same one. It's just the distance between 4 and 5 was spread out in example 1.
Very good. So when you're looking at pictures, you should really pay attention to the vertical or y-axis. So you see, when I went back, it's between 4.36 and 4.54. So really, it makes a small difference look much larger. Whereas when I go to the next slide, you can see that's on the scale 1 to 7, just like what the ECRS-R is on, a scale from 1 to 7. And you see that it's the same difference. It's from a 4.42 to a 4.52. But that shows you the difference is very, very different. So I thought I would start talking about some tips that I would offer to you and others in interpreting research. So the first one is it peer-reviewed? And I often think people think first about, is it something in a peer-reviewed professional journal? And yes, most journals are peer-reviewed, but you can also have a report that has some other type of internal peer review process, so that it's possible for reports that aren't in journals to also be peer-reviewed, and you should look for that in any time you're reading a report. You should also think about who funded the study and whether whoever funded it had a particular agenda. So if somebody, for example, has really been an advocate for a particular intervention, and then they funded an evaluation of that intervention, you might want to think about whether that priority or interest in that intervention influenced the findings. Another thing to think about is the study adequately described? So the authors of a study should give you enough information so that you can judge for yourself whether the conclusions are reasonable from what they did. So if they just really gloss over the questions and jump to the conclusions, you should be cautious about that, because they really do need to provide more information about things like what was the research question, who was included in the sample, what were the procedures that they used to collect the data, basic descriptive information about what they found, their analyses. They should always mention the limitations of the study, and then a discussion, their interpretations of what the findings mean. Another question to think about is who was and was not in the sample. So was it just center-based programs, not family child care? Was it really only 4-year-old children, not infants and toddlers? But those kinds of questions about who's in the sample will help you think about what the research means and doesn't mean. And then finally, think about whether there's a conflict of interest. I was doing a presentation with Dick Clifford last month about measuring quality in child care settings, and the first slide he showed was a statement about his conflict of interest, acknowledging that he's an author on a quality measure, so he has a conflict of interest when he talks about the ECRS-R. I think as a field we're really increasingly more aware of conflict of interest and asking people to report that. So I think that's just something else that we should all be aware of and look for. Other tips. I think it's important for policy decisions to always be made on a body of evidence not just one study. And I think that sometimes can be hard when a study hits the media. I know for myself, when I read the newspaper about, should I drink coffee, should I not drink coffee, should I eat chocolate, should I not eat chocolate, sometimes the media makes that more challenging because they pick up on a particular study, and then, of course, 6 months later there might be another study that finds similar or slightly different results. So I think it's important to think about, you want to be guided by multiple studies, not just any one study. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there will be the good, the bad, and the ugly. Researchers ask questions and gather the data to answer those questions, and sometimes we find what we thought we would find, sometimes we don't. And as consumers of researchers, I think we all need to look carefully at all of the research and not just pick the research studies that that support what we think should be the truth, but really to look at the entire body of evidence, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and think about collectively what does that mean and how does that help us with our thinking. Another tip is to realize that research is really only one source of information used to make policy and administrative decisions. And I will say, as a researcher, I'm sometimes happy just to know that it was one source of information used to make a decision. But I think it also means for policymakers that research is rarely going to have the answer. You're going to have to use research to provide some guidance, and then you're going to need to use other information to make the best decision and to move forward, knowing that you've made the best decision based on what we know at this point in terms of the research, but as we learn more, then you might be able to adjust your decision based on later research. And my final general tip is to make friends with a researcher. That picture is somebody making friends with a researcher. I think there's a lot of research coming out. Some of it is more complicated than others, so I really think it would be nice for state administrators and policy folks to be able to have a researcher whom they trust and know well enough that you could ask them a question if you're not sure of what this means, or ask them to help you review a particular study. And I think there are many ways you can try to find researchers to work with. One is your universities and colleges in your own state, informal networks, going to meetings and conferences and looking at the list of presenters, and then looking at authors who are writing about the particular topics that you're interested in. I also wanted to highlight a few resources. I think Research Connections is a great resource that if you don't already use, I would really encourage you to look at on a regular basis. But I thought today I would highlight some of the resources that they have about understanding research. I will say that their website is organized into three main topics. The Find and Share resources is really, they do summaries of research as they come out, brief overviews, which is really very nice. Then they have a section called Understanding Research. The first part is key questions to ask. So they have questions just like what I had posed earlier, about was the study peer-reviewed, so questions for you to consider. They also have research assessment tools. So they have 2 documents to help you evaluate the quality of research studies. They have one document to help you evaluate the quality of quantitative studies, and they have another document to help you review the quality of qualitative studies. And so for the quantitative studies, they talk about the information that you would expect to see in the report and some standards for good research. For qualitative studies that don't rely on statistics to analyze the data, they acknowledge that there's less consensus about what makes a qualitative study. So they offer 3 different frameworks for you to use to evaluate the a research study that uses qualitative data methods. And then finally, they have a section on Make Connections, which highlights and summarizes some federal meetings that might also be useful. On Research Connections, they also have some links to other resources that will help you understand research, and I thought I would highlight two. Catherine gave you a brief overview of Inquire, and I just wanted to let you know that there is a place on Research Connections where all of the meeting summaries and webinars and tools that are developed as part of Inquire are organized on Research Connections, so that's a nice resource. And then the second resource I wanted to highlight was one that was sponsored by the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. It was a cross-university project to develop a decision maker's guide for reading and interpreting early childhood program evaluations. It's not a terribly long document. It's 12 pages, and it's organized by 5 key questions, such as, is the evaluation strong enough to produce trustworthy evidence? Or how much impact did the program have? So I would really encourage you to use Research Connections and these other resources as an ongoing tool for you when you're reading and trying to interpret research. And Deb, I think I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Hi. Hey, if you have questions, raise your hands or things to add into the conversation, or type into the chat box for Kelly about the tips for thinking about research. One of our questions was around how is your state tracking and assessing the latest research? With whom do you talk about the latest research and its implications for your work? We had seen in the upfront answers to the questions that New York State was saying that they have a subcommittee on research issues named EDNA, a close acronym for Evaluation, Data, Monitoring, and Accountability. It was formed to provide guidance to administrators both on policy issues that can benefit from a research perspective and on research issues. So you can see that New York really set up a protocol to get some help on this question. And I saw a question up front where someone was asking for better tips about how to get a partner in thinking and looking at research, and I think Kelly provided some guidance for that. Kelly, I did have a question about like the dates of the data used in the research. I know, weren't there 2 big studies that people seem to be going back to, and why are researchers doing that? And you know, I was just wondering about that there was I guess some big data sets that people moved back to using. And can you talk for a minute about what that is and what that means?
Sure. You might be thinking about the Science article that used the studies from national pre-K studies that were done about 10 years ago or a little bit more, in 2001 and 2004. I'll say from my perspective, I think that we have very few really large data sets that have information about quality and various components of quality, as well as information about children's skills. So I think many people rely on some older data sets because we don't have very many options. I really think as states are doing more QRIS validation studies, we're going to develop more data sets that have both information about quality and children's skills that will allow us to do more research with more recent data.
Mm-hmm. I see there are a number of states on the call. Have any of you made a relationship with a university or a researcher or someone that you can talk to about research as it comes out, or do you have a standing committee like New York does to work on issues like that? Anybody have anything to add in about other ideas about how they're working on this area, tracking and assessing the latest research? We try to put some out in our e-news as it's been coming out, and certainly Kelly's given us some great ideas of places to track other research and analysis of other research as it comes out. Kelly, you mentioned the class study. I think that one of the interesting parts of that was that they referred to the background, like deep data analysis and how they got the data and some more real specifics. And I think it was important in understanding that piece in particular to reference those background materials, right? Or have someone help you reference them if research isn't your forte.
That's right. So there oftentimes is a very brief summary of research and then a longer, more technical report that would have the information in there that would help you more carefully judge the quality of the research. So yes, I would encourage you to either read the longer report yourself or to find somebody who has research expertise to help read that and help you think about the interpretations of the study.
Kelly, I see that someone's mentioned the National Survey of Early Care and Education. Do you know what that is?
Debbie, this is Catherine. Can I answer that?
Sure, go ahead, jump in.
Kelly, is that okay?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Tony Porter, for asking that question and reminding us of the fantastic resource that will be coming soon. Little bits and pieces have been shared already, but the National Survey of Early Care and Education is going to be, there will be results released over the next year or so, and it's gives information both on the supply of early care and education, so information about programs and providers, but also demand. So it has a household survey, and we can learn about families' use of early care and education, their preferences, their experiences. So that will be an incredible resource that truly gives us a national perspective. The last national study like that was done over 20 years ago. So this is funded by Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, and it will be a great resource to look out for.
So we would find it on their site?
Sure. It will be, yes, it will be, there will be press releases and opportunities to share that with your network, Debbie. Okay,
great. Well, Catherine, since you're on, is Rena next or are you next? Okay, Rena, let's move to Rena, and then we'll come back to Catherine's part. Rena, I'd just like to provide a little bit of an introduction to you. Rena is an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies and the director of Delaware Stars for Early Success at the University of Delaware. Previously, Rena directed a university lab school and served as program coordinator for an Early Head Start program. Her research expertise focuses on systemic issues related to the quality of early care and education programs, with an emphasis on programs serving low-income children and children with disabilities. Rena's served in a lead investigator role across multiple federally funded research projects on topics of early childhood transition, child assessment, and the intersection of child care quality and subsidized child care. Well, you're working in the trenches on this from the state perspective, Rena, so we're really happy to have you here today to share your insights with us. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Debbie. Can everyone hear me? My sound check okay?
Yep.
Great. I'm here to talk a little bit about, and I'm trying to get to the right slide. Thank you. Applying research in a QRS context. I am in a situation where I'm a researcher, but I'm also directing the program at the same time, so I'm very aware of the pressures of trying to make decisions and looking to research, trying to find research to answer the question, and sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And so I've developed a few slides to help us kind of think through that a little bit. And my first thought is there's no magic here, and I think that Kelly's point was really clear on that. We are quality rating and improvement system. It's a very complex task, very complex systems development that's going on, and so there's no one study, not even one avenue of research that helps us find our answers. Research provides us with systematic examinations of lots of different interventions and policies that may be helpful to us in our systems building and quality rating and improvement systems. The reason I wanted to go back and mention this No One QRS study is because, one, we've had some big QRS studies that have recently been published, but also many of us early learning challenge states are working on our validation studies, and often those are they are described as one study. Many of those validation studies, though, are really subsets of studies because there's a lot to disentangle and really think about in relationship to the development and implementation of quality rating and improvement systems. Okay, so there's not one intervention, but rather a framework of standards and quality improvement support. So one of the things that we have to do first is to think about where do we start? Where do we start when we're going to both apply research from other contexts and other states and other settings to our quality rating and improvement system work, as well as to develop and implement research in our own QRIS system. So we have to disentangle what those issues are. And I've given some examples here. Are we interested, in your state you might be interested in coaching, curriculum implementation. In our state in Delaware, we've spent a lot of time recently on issues of supporting high quality curriculum implementation and looking at the research in that area. The issue of professional development, family engagement, all of those are relevant, and there's many, many more in terms of how to scale up those types of interventions. So in order to apply research, we have to know where are we going to start. So identifying and defining your questions and challenges in your QRS. And I actually thought that Catherine said this really well in the beginning when she was talking about the Inquire group, which is, research is better when it's driven by practice needs. So really spending time in your state thinking about what are our true challenges in implementation, what are our true challenges and policy issues, and letting those challenges and issues and struggles define your research efforts. So really letting those questions guide your efforts. In doing that, though, it's important to be specific, and I think this is where it gets a little bit harder. It's usually easy to identify or talk about what is problematic for us or what challenges us in our implementation. But in order to really use research, we have to really drill down and think about specifically what are the issues that we're talking about. So I've given one example here. So what does research tell us about improving classroom environments? That's one question. But we could be more specific if we ask the question, what does research tell us about effective coaching models to support curriculum implementation, which is one aspect of classroom environments. There are many other aspects that we could also ask about. So really thinking about being specific, and this is where connecting with a researcher or a research entity may provide a lot of support to state administrators and state policymakers to help define or refine or nuance that research question. Okay, making it relevant. So study findings can give us strategies about they may give us strategies about how to proceed, but even as we get these new ideas from research, the pressure's still on. We still have to think about how are we going to monitor the documentation, to document and monitor our implementation of these interventions. And this is particularly true, I think, in QRS because we are pulling from research from a lot of different research arenas in professional development, in curriculum, management, administration. And so we may be borrowing ideas from a lot of different places that may be of use to us. And then we have to track and follow and find out, but does it work here? Or are there differences? Do we need to change the conditions in our system to make that intervention or process work? So I'm going to give you an example of something that we're doing in Delaware. And that example is a model that we've developed called STARS Plus. And STARS Plus is an intervention focused on child care programs who either reside in low-income areas or programs who have high numbers of children on subsidy. And we had an issue in our state, which you may also have, where a lot of programs who take child care subsidy were not participating in the quality rating and improvement system, and if they were participating, they weren't moving or making progress in the system. So we developed this model in response to that. So it was a state need. That was our concern. That was our need. STARS Plus includes a couple of different intervention pieces, but I'm just going to focus on one, and that's community of practice. And I know many of you are familiar with the notion of community of practice, but it's an evidence-based practice and educational research. Much of the research on community of practice is really from K-12 literature. We have a lot of literature that teachers and administrators who develop professional learning communities or community of practice are better able to implement and sustain change. So we know that's an evidence-based practice, but we had limited evidence of that practice in a quality rating and improvement system situation, so we decided to try it. So we're borrowing an evidence-based practice and trying to apply it here. And we started this process about 1.5 years ago, and so now we're in the process of implementing and monitoring that process. And I gave you a couple of examples on the slide of how we're doing that. We are, for example, looking at movement. Our programs that are participating in STARS Plus and are participating in community of practice, are they faring better in the quality rating and improvement system? We are reviewing the technical assistance data for those programs, both centers and family child care, what's going on during the technical assistance visit. And we're also spending a lot of time with the technical assistants who are connected to those STARS Plus community of practice, listening to them both in what supports do they need, but also their implementation strategies. And here are just some early findings and some examples of what I would consider kind of course correction using data to make some changes in the intervention. So some of our early findings relates to commitment to the community of practice. We found that providers, at least in the small groups that we're currently implementing, higher levels of commitment to community of practice are resulting in more movement in the quality rating and improvement system. And so we've been doing some work earlier in the implementation to help support the providers in making that commitment. We've added a provider letter of commitment, so we're increasing our implementation in that way. We're also finding that it actually is working better in family child care than in centers. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that to be true, and it's kind of consistent with some of the work in family child care. And so based on that, we're making some modifications to increase the number of family child care STARS Plus groups. And that's happening now. And we also know from listening to the TAs who are facilitating those community of practices that in fact they need additional support in implementing and organizing the actual community of practice meetings. And so we've added some additional support, quarterly meetings in particular, and some additional materials to support them in their work to build and sustain these community of practices. In addition to that, this kind of shows that this research stuff is a cycle. We also wrote a federal grant, and we're just awarded a federal grant to more carefully study the impact of STARS Plus and community practice on a larger number of family child care providers. So this is an example of that emerging from a state need, an issue that we had, using research to develop a strategy or an approach. We're implementing that, and we're still early in our implementation. But then following that and using our own data to make decisions about our implementation strategy, and then seeking some additional resources to more fully launch a new research study on that piece. So, Debbie, do you want to?
Yes. So I would like to offer the floor for questions or comments about what Rena presented here, or if you have other ideas about how you're handling this within your state. But I did have a question. Two things that you said were really of interest to me. How do you, if you're using data and thinking about a question within a state, when do you make a decision about whether you do it as an internal evaluation or research, or whether you need to hire someone from outside? Like, how do you make that decision, and how do you keep from having a conflict of interest about, obviously there probably isn't anything to be gained from the results and next steps. You were really looking to inform what you were going to do next. But in the case of, I don't know, child outcomes or something else like that, when do you make that decision, and how do you make the decision about when you keep it internal and when you get an outside researcher to work with you?
I think that's a really great question, Debbie, and we are in a kind of a unique situation here in Delaware. I think that for us, we've used a combination of strategies, and sometimes those decisions are very practical, around what resources are available for an external evaluation, to be able to feed into, and in what place do you move to the external evaluation. We have, because we're an early learning challenge state, we have a validation study that we are about to launch, and so this STARS Plus piece will actually be a part of that. So I didn't mention that, but that is an important element too, is that we will get some external evaluation. For me, though, if we didn't have that opportunity, I think that we would want to more fully develop the implementation strategy before we would want to work with the state to do an external evaluation. So I'm thinking of implementation science work, and some of those frameworks I think are really useful here. It's like using data, gathering data to make decisions, in a more rapid way. And then once you have an intervention or, that is more well developed, then it's probably time to bring in an external evaluator. You need to really know the pieces of what you're doing, whether it's curriculum, coaching for curriculum implementation, or the community of practice piece, or a new strategy to support the workforce around family engagement. I think that you want to be very clear what you want to be evaluated by an external evaluator to make that investment and have it well developed and installed.
So it allows you to use data in kind of a smaller scale way to impact implementation more quickly in a more cost-effective, you know what I mean, without some of the heavy costs of a big research study. It might also allow you to hone in on what are your questions and clarify what is important before you bring in an outside researcher to work with you on something. It can give you more clarity about what questions are you asking and what's important, So
it will give you more clarity, and it also is helpful because it helps you refine the data elements. And so if you're implementing a particular practice or intervention, and you want to track it, if you're working on internally tracking the success or implementation of that intervention, you need data to be able to do that. So you need to ask yourself and your partners, what kinds of information, and are we using different kinds of information to document?
So do you even have are you collecting the data that could answer the question?
That's right. So
okay.
Or do you have a database in your QRS system where you're getting enough information to connect the inputs, if you will, to the outputs? And because even when you're working internally, those data are pretty clear. STAR levels, types of technical assistance provided, those types of things. You can do a secondary analysis of those, some of that type of data, and that can really be helpful and give you a lot of information.
But you really got to some interesting points about the tech, and I don't know if that was a data source as much where you uncovered that the technical assistance providers felt like they needed additional support. Was that, did you do a survey with the technical assistance folks? Or
we did. Actually, I didn't.
Out?
I asked a colleague, I'm in the university, I asked a faculty colleague to do a focus group with that specialized group. And so that was a pretty low cost, investment. And so she did a focus group and wrote a report to us and gave us this information, a variety. It was a lot of really helpful information. And then we used that to restructure some supports for the staff who were implementing.
It's great the way you wrote this because you can really see how the things you uncovered could directly move into a stronger implementation of the project. So that was very interesting. Another thing you mentioned was using and thinking about research from another discipline and almost using that to inform figuring out if that worked the same in the setting of early childhood or in QRIS. Like you looked at the research about communities of practices from a K-12 system perspective, and you applied that, as a theory or a hypothesis to what you might uncover.
Right. And I think it's important to be open, to be able to look at other disciplines and other contexts, especially because, QRS is it's still relatively new. And so we have research on QRS, but we don't have a lot of research on QRS. And so we often have to go to other settings, and to other contexts, other disciplines, to try to identify strategies that might be.
Yeah, and K-12 seems like kind of a natural one to look at.
Right.
What have they tried? What have they seen working? And what do those things mean to us in our quality improvement work? Well, that's very, very interesting. We do have a question about talking a little bit more about validation studies. Why don't I hold that till the end, and let's ask the three of you to think a little bit about how you might talk a little bit more about the validation studies of the Race to the Top and those efforts, and provide some information. But before we get to that big question, let's let Catherine finish our presentation here, and we'll come back to that, okay? Okay, Catherine.
Great. Thank you. So I'm putting information that could take up a graduate seminar into 3 slides, and not because I think we can get it all in 3 slides, but I think our intention here is to just give some of our biggest tips, our do's, our don'ts, and some of the myths. And so hopefully you'll excuse rushing through some of these really, really important pieces. But the purpose is to just be clear about what we think are some of the key things to consider when you're doing QRIS evaluation in your own state. And we've already gotten into that conversation through some of the examples that Rena gave, and already some of the points from some of my slides have been anticipated. So that's great. I think all of these presentations hopefully are coming together with some common themes. I think first and foremost, in the list of 4 do's that I pulled out, and just to note as well, this is from a presentation that I did with Gretchen Kirby this summer at the Build QRIS National Meeting, which was called QRIS Evaluation 101. And so we really did try to think about just the basics here. And I think one of the number one basics, there are, of course, lots of high priorities here, but the first is to really map out the activities and expected outcomes. And we're talking about very complex systems here, as we've all said. There is not one intervention or one activity. QRIS is really, as it's been called, a framework for bringing together multiple activities, which makes this task, to be honest, a hard task. To sit with participants in the system, the stakeholders, and to be clear about the expected outcomes. And I have found, even though I think there's sometimes an initial eye rolling at the idea of a logic model and its purpose, once you get into it, once you have something to look at and react to as a group, it can be an extremely productive discussion and can really help clarify and help you move towards the next do, which is to develop and prioritize your research questions, and to do that in line with their QRIS. The importance here is that you want to make sure that the questions you're addressing are really those that are going to help you answer some of those issues that you're encountering at different stages of development. So for example, early on in your QRIS, you may have questions about the recruitment strategies you're using, about how partners are communicating across agencies, how are the coaches getting trained, how is the rating process working. Some of these questions, while they may not seem worthy of a journal article, they certainly are important for the functioning of your QRIS, and I know from having done some of this research that it's extremely important to address those implementation questions early on. As you move towards later stages of the QRIS, you may have questions more about the outcomes. For example, how well are your quality improvement strategies working? Are programs moving up the QRIS ratings, and what, if anything, can be linked to that movement? And here you run into some questions. You need to be careful here about attributing causality and assuming that it's the QRIS that is helping programs move along. But again, those are some of the kinds of things you can address, thinking back to some of Kelly's points and working with a researcher who can help you with some of these outcomes type questions. And then as you move into later stages of the QRIS, here you may be addressing, as many states are, questions about revising your indicators, revising your rating process, and this important question of validation that I think we're waiting to address a little bit more until the end. But certainly I'll address, Gary, your question about the distinction between QRIS validation studies and evaluation. The way that I've been thinking about validation, and I think our Inquire group, is that validation is really one part of an overall evaluation strategy. So it's one set of research questions, but it's not the only set of questions that could be answered and addressed. And I think that's why, especially going back to the logic model and to look and see where these questions about functioning of your rating process and your quality indicators, where does that fit into your overall model of how your QRIS is working. And in some cases, states that are required, you will be prioritizing those validation questions because you need to for Race to the Top. But other states may choose to focus on early implementation questions or other types of questions. Okay, so thinking about then the next really important piece here in EDU is consider the use of available data. So Rena gave this great example of collecting new data, focus group data, but for those states where you don't have that opportunity, I noticed in the questions there were many of you who raised issues of funding and said, how can we do this for no additional resources? And while I can't say that research is going to cost nothing, I think there are some lower cost strategies that can be considered, and this is by far one of the biggest, which is to consider how you can use the data you already have about your system for your research. So for example, you'll want to, you could tap into your case management data. Rena mentioned the data they had on how providers are how coaches are delivering technical assistance, the number of hours, the types of activities they're involved, and then how programs are moving or not moving up the QRIS ratings as a result. Those data are not necessarily simple to analyze, but they're data that you don't need to invest in additional data collection to gather because you hopefully are already gathering them. But because of the importance of this, I also want to just make a plug for putting processes in place within your implementation team to make sure you're collecting the very best data that you can collect. That's making sure if you are going to rely on your case management data, that means that the coaches, the trainers, anyone who is entering data into that system needs to be trained, and you need to ensure that everyone is entering data in the same way so that you can include it. Okay, then finally, just another very important do, one of many, is to select a feasible research design that's in line with your questions, your resources, most importantly probably resources for many of you, and your time frame for evaluation. So this is just this is a question that we could spend a lot of time, but I'll just briefly say that back to the other piece about prioritizing your questions, here you also want to think about the types of designs that will work. And primarily early on and with limited resources, you likely will be choosing more descriptive type studies where you're collecting information and using that very important information about implementation and early adopters of the QRIS to learn about your systems. But as you have resources available, if you're lucky to have a federal grant like Rena described, or if you're using validation resources through Race to the Top, for example, there you may have enough to invest in a longer-term study where you might be able to collect data longitudinally, and you have a longer time frame for evaluation. That said, even a 4-year study, when we're thinking about starting up a quality rating and improvement system, by 4 years, you may not be at a point where you can look at some of the questions. For example, any questions about outcomes for providers or especially for children. That type of time frame may not be sufficient for some of those outcomes. So it's very important to map out the time frame, and again, going back to prioritizing your research questions, so that you can set up a study design that's realistic. And again, I recognize that this is a very brief walkthrough, but just wanted to highlight some of these important do's, and hope we can address any questions you might have about any of those specifics later on. All right, well then let's move quickly to don'ts. I think it's very important to think about just the timing of evaluation, and I think it's don't wait to plan for evaluation, but also don't ever think it's too late. It's not too late for evaluation. You can do evaluation at any point in your system. It's best if you can start early and revisit often, but and especially because, as Rena was mentioning, that helps you set up the data right from the beginning, so you've got the data collected that you can use, and that makes all of the data collection as you move through your system makes that of higher quality, hopefully, and able to be tapped into for your evaluation. But again, it doesn't. You're never too late to come up with these questions, and we often say that related to validation as well. Some states may say, well, our system's already been going for 5 years, so we're probably past the point of validation. And that's not true. Validation and looking at how well your system is distinguishing quality and the way that the ratings are working in your state it's never too late to look at that, because as we know, most QRISs are about continuous quality improvement and looking for ways to refine the systems. A really key point here, and this is something that even starting at the beginning with the logic model, but don't exclude key stakeholders from planning. I think it's really important early on to have buy-in to the purpose of any research you're doing, and to be able to say, this is what we can look at in this study, especially in validation studies. I think this is important to say, this is what we can learn, and this is what we know we can't learn from this study because of the design we're using. For example, most validation studies are not going to be able to tell us how a QRIS affects children, because that's not the design. We may be able to look at how QRIS measures are related to children's developmental progress, but that's a different question. That's not a question about causing child outcomes. So just important here to make sure that you have stakeholders involved who understand the purposes of your evaluation and what you can and can't say. Don't reinvent the wheel, for sure. I'll have some slides in a minute here that will show some available resources. I, of course, put the ones that I'm familiar with through Inquire, but there are many other resources, including technical assistance providers through the Quality Center, PDW Center, other Build, any other TAs that you may be working with, and for sure they are an excellent source of information, and we want to make sure to share resources whenever possible. Also, just the final don't to be thinking about selection issues, and we know especially as you're launching a QRIS and you have programs early on in your system, remember that these programs may be unique, and there may be selection issues, there will be selection issues that you'll need to take into account as you're doing your study. So make sure to mine that available data to understand that group you have in your QRIS and how it may be different from other programs, other families in your state. Okay, and then finally I just want to do a few myths, and we've already touched on a couple of these. First myth is that implementation studies are not rigorous. Implementation studies can be very rigorous, and I think what we need to consider here is being sure that you engage if you would like to do research on implementation. Some of it can be quite formative, where you address, as Debbie was asking, does it all have to be done by an external evaluator? No, it doesn't, but you want to make sure that you have a clear question and a clear strategy for how you're going to address implementation studies. Sometimes I think having an external evaluator can be really important because it provides that outside, more objective perspective on implementation, especially early on when there are a number of issues, and it helps to have somebody who's external to the process to provide some recommendations and some insights into how it's going. But certainly just remember that if implementation studies can be done rigorously. There are many qualitative methods that are appropriate to use in implementation studies, as well as quantitative methods, and working with an evaluator can really help you answer and address some of these critical questions at any point, not just at the beginning. Another myth is that evaluation requires new data collection. We touched on this. Remember to use available data in your system because that's one of your greatest assets as you launch an evaluation. This we've talked about already, that a myth is that evaluation can only be done by an external research team. And while we've said that, of course, there are evaluation questions that can be addressed internally, one of the situations that I find in working with states is that often staff are extremely tapped, extremely busy, many things, many other demands on their time, so that having the space to be able to focus on running some data, looking at numbers, that's very hard to do often. So while it is possible to do internal research, you need to make sure that if someone is having that put on their plate, that they have something else taken off their plate so that they can actually focus on this, because it does take time and effort and energy. And then finally, all evaluations take a long time. I think that's also a myth that if we're going to invest in evaluation, it needs to be really expensive or take multiple years. As we've said, hopefully through the many examples we've given, there can be evaluations that address just smaller or questions of a smaller scope that can be done in a shorter time, and that you can use right away to inform your system. Certainly there are some really important longitudinal questions that will take a number of years to look at, but really evaluation depends on the question being asked, and it doesn't have to take a long time. So I'll stop there, Debbie. Oh, wait, I do have one more slide on resources. Again, these are just the pictures, and I think Debbie is making the slides available, but these are just some of the resources you can check into.
Yes, the slides will be posted. Now, to the validation question, let's go to our question screen. We have a question in the chat box about selection issues and a little bit more about what that means. And Gary, I don't know, just take yourself off mute, and why don't you go ahead and phrase your question so that we make sure that we have it right. Selection issues between QRIS tiers, and can you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question? All right.
Press *7 to unmute if you've used our system, Gary.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yep.
Gotcha.
Oh, cool. Okay, that works. First of all, hi, Kelly. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Gary.
So I think for people who aren't familiar, I think it's worth providing a little bit more about what selection issues are and what they mean in terms of both designing a study, but more importantly, interpreting the results of a study. And selection factors always have an impact in studies of early child care because it's parents ultimately who choose where their kids are going to go. And in particular with QRIS, I think that what has not been addressed is that the internal selection factors that occur when providers are assigned a tier, and that there may be different children and families enrolled in different tiers for a variety of reasons, having to do with how parents choose child care. Mm-hmm. And then the other question also has to do with, I guess as a researcher, if I'm talking to policy people, to understand in interpreting the results of studies, the understanding that you need to look at the effects of what is called clustering, because you've got children clustered within providers, and you have to pull out the effects of children within the same provider as opposed to children across providers when you're looking at the relationship between quality and outcomes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of two separate questions, but maybe they're overly technical, and that's absolutely fine if that's
well, I just appreciate you raising them and describing them. I think you did a really nice job of describing them, and I guess my recommendation is that if you are as you engage in a study or put out an RFP, that it's really important to understand these issues and hopefully engage a consultant or an evaluator that can help walk through the strategies that are used to address these concerns. That's, I think, other than going too deep into the technical, unless, Gary, you think there's something else we could say about it.
No, I think that I think you're absolutely right. I think they are technical issues. They do affect how you design a study, but more important, well, just as important, is also how to interpret and read studies that have been done. And you're reading a report of a study, and you should sort of check off in your mind, did they talk about selection issues? And in their results, especially if they're linking quality to child outcomes, did they actually take into effect clustering? And
so
if they didn't, then the results are going to be very different.
Great, thanks.
And I liked what you said too there, Catherine, about sometimes you really need help to even get an RFP that gets to what you want. You might need consultation or help to do an RFP for a evaluation or validation type of a study, because you want to make sure that you've gotten the questions and all the technical aspects that you're happy with the product at the end, right?
Right, right.
I would totally agree with that. I think it's very important. It's a lot more complicated to put an RFP together than I think we first think.
Yeah.
I also wanted to add one other thing. I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. Go on.
Okay, Kelly, you wanted to say something?
I did just want to point out that on this slide there's the Quality Rating and Improvement System Evaluation Toolkit, and they actually have a section on tips for developing an RFP to do an evaluation.
Thanks for mentioning that.
Thanks, Kelly. And they also there's also a chapter in the toolkit about developing a logic model, and I'm really sorry about this picture back here that just had a teeny tiny little logic model at the bottom, just more as a little tiny graphic. It wasn't to go through it, but there's much more detail in the toolkit about how to create those, and there are also references to other fantastic sources on how to do a logic model.
Sorry. Hi, this is Gary. I just wanted to also mention the reason why I think these issues, while they sound very technical and minor, perhaps, is we're always trying to interpret what the effects of quality are on children's development and children's developmental status, which in my mind is kind of not the key question, but everybody is focused on that, and we have mixed results. And the results can be modest to a modest effect to no effects. And I think that some of the reasons why we're not getting a clear signal on this is because these issues are not taken into account.
Great, thanks, Gary.
Could our presenters talk a little bit about how can you tell if, like when you read a research study, how do you put it in a place of, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to keep tracking that, to when there's a body of evidence where it becomes clear that you need to change something. I remember back in the, a couple of years ago when we were thinking about that, and we were getting a lot of research about how having a curriculum and implementing a curriculum was important, to child outcomes or the quality of the program. And we felt like there was a substantial enough body of evidence for us to add that in as a standard. That you needed to have a curriculum, staff needed to be trained on it, it had to align with the learning standards in the state, and we made a move based on our feeling that we had more than a watch and see kind of proposition. We had enough evidence to feel like that was going to move us ahead. How do you researchers think about that?
This is Kelly. I'll start the conversation. Number one, I do think going back to a point I made about it's never just one study, so you really look for, is there a finding that's been replicated in more than one study with the kinds of children, birth to 5, if that's what we're thinking about for a QRIS. and the studies have been done in such a way that you are confident that they've done well so that you can trust the findings. So for me, replication is one of the key things, so that I need to see similar results from similar groups of researchers asking similar questions.
Thank you.
I think there are also...
Oh, go ahead, Rena.
Okay, there's a couple of other resources too. You know, there's the IES What Works Clearinghouse that, and I know we were actually just on that website with our administrators just last week talking about curriculum, and it's just another resource, another tool that you can. It's an aggregator. You know, research on a variety of areas. Curriculum is in early childhood is one of the biggest pieces there, and there's some on professional development.
Can you send me the link to that, and then we'll make sure to post it early next week along with this webinar?
I will do that, definitely.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so that's
also like, this is Catherine, I also like to look for consensus documents, like National Academies of Science reports, like there was even a very recent report on pre-K that just came out, or not a report, but a synthesis of findings. And I think when we can find expert panels that have addressed, again, you still with those questions that Kelly asked earlier, but turning to where we can find expert panels that have really looked at the available evidence and tried to draw some conclusions, I find those types of documents really useful. And I think also with many of the pieces of QRIS implementation, there certainly isn't going to be a study out there. We already know this. I think there's lots of good guidance, but there aren't studies that say this is exactly what you should put into your QRIS and this is where the cut points you should make. Right now there is not a study that tells you how to do that or a formula, and so there are some very difficult questions in the design and implementation of a QRIS that you're not going to be able to find the specific answer in a research study. And that's why I think making sure we have great data so that we can start looking across different models and trying to understand what's working.
Now, Inquire helped us by giving us some ideas about what types of data elements we should be collecting. Because one of my questions is around each state is so unique that, like, comparing how that research informs your state process, it can be so different because you might have different economic or geography, or just, there's so much impacting how different each state is in terms of how they're constructing the QRIS, what their standards are, what their levels are, what their incentives are, and so that kind of takes looking at the research from other states and across the country. You have to keep that in mind too. What's going to play in our state or work for the way we have things set up here too.
Exactly. And I think we have some opportunities with some of the discussions that are going on, thinking about are there particular cross-state validation questions that we could be answering by making sure that certain questions or certain data elements are included in different state validation studies. So I think that's one strategy we can use, is to try and standardize at least the data collection across states, and being intentional at the beginning about that. And I think there's also some cross-state efforts that we can use, and they're difficult because, as you said, Debbie, there's such variations across the states, but there may be certain questions where if we had some comparable data across states, we could really get to some answers. So I think there's lots of opportunities here. It certainly has its challenges with using data across different states, but I think some of these will be really worth an investment.
Does anyone on the call have other ideas about how they're handling or looking at research or thinking about research in their state that would be helpful to add into the conversation? Because it's folks in the field doing this work and states as they're constructing the body of knowledge and how they're looking at things. Let me give you an example. I heard from a state just this week who was taking the science article that came out about pre-K and the 3 or 4 different blogs that were done about that. Child Trends, of course, weighed in, and Linda Smith weighed in, and Tim Bartek weighed in, and Sarah Mead. There was just a lot, and I put in my 2 cents worth. There was a lot written about it, and their study group is going to kind of look at all of that and have a discussion and a meeting about what does this mean policy-wise and implementation-wise and where our QRIS is. So they were actually going to take a study and what was written in terms of responses and analysis of it and have a team discussion about it. Are there other strategies like that that states are using, or how are you coalescing? Feel free to put something in our chat box, or just raise your hand, or unmute yourself and jump right in if you have something to add that would help us think about this. I'll look at my...
This is Catherine. I'll just raise an example from Minnesota where we are now putting the evaluation on the quarterly Parent Aware Advisory Committee meeting agendas. So these are implementation meetings of groups in agencies from our state agencies, other partners, but I just think having that group, even if it's a half hour each quarter, keeping evaluation, new research, new findings, new strategies within the evaluation, having that on the agenda has been a really helpful way to, again, just keep everyone on the same page, get new ideas for research. If it's not on the agenda, you probably aren't going to spend a lot of time talking about research. So I would recommend, if you have an opportunity to add something like that to ongoing meetings, it's a really helpful way to keep this as part of your state, some of the state activities you're working on in your QRIS.
And I saw in one of our notes that someone said that their ECAC quality improvement, they have an evaluation subgroup that gives research design and implementation recommendations. So they actually put a research group into the design of their committee structure, which I thought was a really interesting idea. Do states typically, from your guys' experience, set aside, we had a question about how do states, those that, in particular that didn't get raised to the top or something like that, how are states funding research? Where are they getting money to do this? Is there a recommendation about that, or do you have any anecdotal, just general advice about how states look at that?
This is Catherine. I'll jump in, and I think that Kelly and Rena will have some ideas too. I think if you are in a state where you have some philanthropy partners, for example, there are a number of states that may be able to fund smaller studies. It's probably not going to be a multi-million-dollar study, but I think certainly there is so much research that can be done for smaller amounts of money, or if you can get a coalition of funders to contribute for evaluation. And again, I know there are many places where you may not feel like you have that resource available, but I do think that's one important resource, or possibly a United Way. Our Greater Twin Cities United Way funds part of our research for Parent Aware in Minnesota. That's another possible option for some of you. And I think some states are also using some of their CCDF administrative dollars to fund some research as well. So I think there are some options. And I know probably some of you on the phone have many more creative ideas than I do about that.
Those were a great starter for it, and I do think that some states put in some of their CCDF dollars. I think that you're right about you can bite off smaller pieces with data that you have. I did have another question that was posed among difficult research issues. One issue that stands out for people as most difficult is how to approach child outcomes data collection. especially the need for useful baseline data. I know that this could be a 4-hour webinar probably in and of itself, but would the resources that we've already shown give people a starting place on thinking about that, or is there anything else from your experience working with states that you would say? This is kind of in the beginning phases really within states, thinking about how to figure out the child outcome piece.
This is Kelly. I think the resources that we've shown already in terms of the validation template and the validation brief are good starting places. And I do think this is one of those questions where you really do need to work with an independent evaluator who has had experience doing this kind of study because of all of the complexities in doing this well, so that you are confident in the information when you finish the study.
Mm-hmm. And this also kind of takes me back to what Catherine was saying about the stages of implementation. If you've just started a QRIS, is it the time to be looking at child outcomes and data versus implementation studies? So really matching up the type of study you're doing with the phase of where you are in your work. That doesn't mean you can't move ahead with setting the stage or getting some processes in order that would enable you down the line to be able to accomplish a study like that. But it might not be a study that you're going to do in the first year or two of implementation of a QRS because you're not stabilized in your implementation yet.
And there might be, Debbie, there might be other kind of intermediate outcomes that you're interested in or would, based on your logic model, think that you might actually impact earlier, right, in your implementation. And so you might want to use those as outcomes in your earlier work. And again, that's the importance of the logic model that Catherine was talking about, to really think through where you are in implementation relative to the outcome data that would actually answer your question.
Mm-hmm. All right. Gary, did you want to chime in on this?
Yes. I think the big issue and the issue that Inquire identified in the documents that Catherine told you about on the screen, the compendium and the methods for validation, yeah, that one, the resources. What they basically say is it's very costly to do proper child outcome measurement. And so to combat the costs, I think some people make some decisions which may affect the precision and the reliability of the results that you get. Certainly one of the cost-saving strategies is to not do direct assessment of children, but rather to use ratings from teachers, caregivers, whatever. And these are certainly less than ideal. There are going to be known rater effects in there. But there are other sort of cost strategies to consider, and when you're working with an evaluator to go through these. For example, who are the ones going out and doing the direct assessments if you choose to do the direct assessments? And typically most evaluators, most research companies have, send out trained third-party data collectors to do it. But in a few studies, they've actually trained staff, child care staff, to do the assessments, and with the caveat that that a teacher not assess their own child, the child in their classroom. But so that's kind of one thing to consider. I was at American Evaluation Association. Bill Gormley was talking, and I had forgotten this about the Oklahoma study, looking at the effects of pre-K. That he actually trained staff to collect data on the children using direct assessment. So I thought that was an interesting approach. And the other thing to consider when you think about costs and the kind of domains you want to pick up is when you're measuring social development, you typically have to use teacher rating system. That's pretty much the only way to go. And when you're measuring emergent literacy, cognitive outcomes, think carefully about how much overlap there is in some of the measures. You don't necessarily always have to pick 10 different measures that then requires 40 to 60 minutes of time to assess a 3 or 4-year-old on, especially if a lot of those measures are highly correlated with each other. So those are some of the things to consider when you're talking to an evaluator about doing child outcome assessment. I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Well, and that's really just gives us a sense of how much there is to look at when you're thinking about putting together one of these studies. Not seeing any further questions, I did want to tell you while I have Catherine and Kelly on the phone that the BUILD initiative has provided funding to Child Trends to manage the development of an interactive website that provides information about policies and procedures in state QRISs. We're going to call it the QRIS Online Compendium. Very creative. But it mirrors the 2010 and updates the 2010 compendium with an online feature that will provide policymakers, administrators, researchers, and others with up-to-date detailed information about the various dimensions of states' QRIS operations. We're very excited about this. 4 states are going to help us get started, making sure that we're collecting data well and that we have a good alignment with data collection between all the reporting that states have to do, so we're not duplicative, but that we're leveraging the data collection from the CCDF plan and the Race to the Top documents if you're in Race to the Top, and the quality improvement plan. So we're very excited about this. Catherine, is there anything else that you would tell the audience about it that might be helpful to them? But I know we've started working on it.
Yes, we have. We have started working on it. It's really exciting. We have been really happy with how the compendium in the paper form or in the PDF form was useful, and we think this will be a step up in terms of usefulness because you'll be able to customize and select the features or the states that you want to look at and hopefully be able to access information a little more easily than you could do in the previous compendium. So we're excited, and we're also just, I guess, a request that when it's hopefully time for your state to be involved, that you consider participating, because I think the more examples we can include, the better.
And I'll tell you, we get questions, and I know Catherine does, and Kelly, and probably Rena too, all the time. What's the participation rate of family child care homes and QRIS across the country? And it's very difficult with such a vibrant system and in such a big development phase right now to answer those kinds of questions. And we're really hoping that updating this compendium will provide us all with some good information and help us really be able to move forward in our work and understand the system across the country that can inform our work within the state. So we're very excited, and you'll be hearing more about this over the next few months. So we're really looking forward to it. Well, we'd like to thank everyone, and certainly our presenters today, for sharing their wisdom, and the audience for chipping in with answers and questions and upfront questions along the way. And we look forward to next month's Let's Talk on November 20th. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
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 Thank you. Please stand by.